Greetings, everyone. This one's going to be fairly short and sort of grim just because of the history of this region. Also, when I post this on YouTube, I'll also have a link attached to a rather depressing Wikipedia citation on just one example of this whole sort of mess. One of the things to remember is, again, as I was mentioning earlier, we were talking about earlier in the week, is that in this particular part of the world, what you have is the boundaries that define originally colonies and then later independent states aren't based on ethnicity. So they're not based on history in the sense of people lived in a place. They're not based on the fact that the boundary basically defines a group that lived in that place. So it's not like the French versus the Germans versus the Swiss or something like that, where the national boundaries do sort of reflect, like ethnic variation. The boundaries here are entirely arbitrary. They have no relationship to the people who live on the land. They were entirely generated by Europeans, thousands of miles away who didn't give a squat about the place at all. And that reference to the Congo Free State atrocities that I'll show you the link is a real good example. You could get away with things in this area that you couldn't get away with anywhere else in the world, simply because no one cared outside of the continent. And to a certain extent, that's still true with Sub-Saharan Africa today. So when you look at the huge amount of political, social, other types of disruption, the huge depressing patterns of genocide in the region, exploitation, all the stuff like that that's been going on for a long time, it's still going on in 2020. And you look at Europeans to now the Chinese, Americans who pretty much sort of wash their hands of a lot of this and basically say, well, we tried. To a certain extent, there's some truth in that, but it's also just because this isn't an area where people outside of the area really feel a huge urge or need to spend the extra time and effort to get something done. And part of that is if you've got a country whose boundaries are only based on someone drawing a map in France, then the people in that particular set of boundaries don't have a sense of being part of a group. Their group is either going to be based on ethnicity, i.e. the people that identify themselves as a particular population, maybe speak a common language, common shared historical background, whatever, or in much of this region, it isn't even at that level. So it's not even at the idea of ethnic identity that we've seen in the rest of the semester. In much of this region, it shrinks down to family. Your large extended family group is the only group that you basically have any affiliation or loyalty to. Anything larger than that is just sort of, it's just out there. You might understand it abstractly, but you don't see any particular compelling need to buy into it as being something relevant to you. And going back to, if we go down, if you look at this kleptocracy, that's why kleptocracies are real common in this region. If you see yourself and your identity as part of a family, if you ended up in a political situation where you have control of the country or part of a country, you see absolutely nothing wrong in taking advantage of that position in terms of the resources, the money, whatever, to benefit your family at the cost of anyone else, because as far as you're concerned, everyone outside of family sort of is, they're not relevant to you. And your attitude, in many cases, cynically probably true, is if you're not in that job and someone else from another family takes that position, they're going to rip everyone off for their family. So it's like, well, I got lucky, I won the lottery, so I might as well take advantage of it because everyone else will do the same thing I'll do. So this rationalization based on family identity is really, really important to understand when you're looking at this part of Africa. And to a certain extent, that's why when European governments or the United Nations, the United States, or whoever pour money and the resources into these regions, you frequently find that the money disappears. You end up with a couple of families that all of a sudden get really, really wealthy, and all everything, whatever it was you were trying to fix, it never gets to the people that are actually in need. And if you actually confront the folks that stole the money, they're sort of like, well, yeah, well, so what? If I didn't do it, someone else would do it. So there's no, it's not that people aren't moral, but it's that their social morality ends with family. It doesn't extend to the larger population. And I think that's at some point, changing that is probably the biggest stumbling block to fixing some of the problems that exist in Sub-Saharan Africa. Until you get people to identify at larger levels than the family, you're not going to be able to make change happen because people have no compelling reason to buy into your argument. Places where you don't see that, and again, if you remember, I was talking about the Zulus last time, large, ethnic, cultural movement, East Africa moving south. It's not by accident that they're the largest political movement in the country of South Africa, simply because they do see themselves very proudly as an ethnic group. So they don't see themselves as family, they see themselves as larger pattern, which we see in most of the rest of the world, where people identify to a higher, level of association. And not surprisingly, that gives them an enormous amount of power in the parts of Africa that exist, and simply because they can muster a much larger set of resources, they can organize at a higher level with more people involved. And that gives an enormous amount of leverage over a bunch of other folks who basically don't see anything other than family. So the combination of the fact that you have countries whose boundaries make no sense at all, and the fact that people, not even in many areas, don't even see themselves as ethnic, they see themselves as some smaller group, just makes for an absolute nightmare. Most famous would be Rwanda, with the genocide there. But that's actually just that's just one of a ton of these. The idea of the boy soldiers, the kid soldiers that you see in the DRC. All these types are reflective of the same sort of really grim set of attitudes, which have to do with the fact that people don't see taking advantage of others outside of family as being something morally or ethically wrong. They just see it as reality. And in that context, the fact that so much of the population of the Western region was involved in the slave trade over the last 400 or 500 years starts to make a little more sense. Because in their attitude, person outside of the family is just, they're just sort of there. They're just something, and if you can take it, it's like the equivalent of having a $100 bill lying on the ground and there's no one around. Well, you'd be stupid not to take it. So this is important to understand, because when you look at this area, you look at that short video that I posted for you guys to look at, you see this whole idea of institutionalized political corruption, especially in government. It's just being so widespread in this area that the United Nations doesn't even do a lot of programs it could do in the area, just because they figure the money's just going to disappear. So it's a waste of their money and effort to try to make change, because they're pretty sure they can't have the change actually happen. So it's one of the grim realities of this part of the world. Now, a part that doesn't really get too much brought up in this, which I can't remember if I had you guys look at the Miller video on consumption, but if you go back to where we're looking at the Pacific, you see the same phenomena here, but even more so. If you think of the Pacific, going back to what we were looking at last week, then you've got a region where large parts of the region don't have access to a lot of resources or cash. But at least in that region, what you have is many of those areas have some way to get to somewhere else. So for example, there's very little in the way of a cash economy in Tonga. But tons of Tongans live in New Zealand and other places, so they can send money back home. So this whole remittance economy scheme, which is so typical in Southeast Asia and also in the Pacific. When you get into Sub-Saharan Africa, and their ability to move to other parts of the world that will provide that remittance is pretty much non-existent. So they can't even engage in the practice you have in other areas of the report, where you can send family members out to some job in some other part of the world, say in Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia or Hong Kong or wherever, and they can send money back. But the folks in this part of Africa are pretty much stuck. They can't even leave. And if they do, they don't have enough skills and no one's interested in hiring them. So they're pretty much trapped on a continent where there's very little in the way of resources. And they're trapped in the sense that they can't go to other parts of the world to take advantage of this. This need to provide remittances and to find someone into a cash economy system is also why you see so many of the political economic refugees out of North Africa spilling into Europe. In some cases that's political, but in a lot of cases just folks who there's basically absolutely no way to make any money at all in their home country. So you desperately will do anything you can to get to somewhere where the possibility of a job, even a chump change crappy job, is a hell of a lot better than anything else you got. But you get south of the Sahara, that ain't happening. Now, what you also have to remember, though, is especially now in a global, digitized, internet-based world, is those same people are watching YouTube and all the rest of this stuff So they're still getting exposed to the same stuff that you guys get exposed 24/7, especially now everyone's stuck at home, of things to buy and things you could do and how to, and things you should consume cash on. But to a certain extent, since you're students, you don't have a lot of money, but there's the potential for having money pretty soon when you get out and you get a good job, etc. Think of being in a situation where you're watching all the same stuff you're watching. You're hearing all the same ads you hear, but you're trapped in Sub-Saharan Africa where your average pay scheme is probably about 15 cents a week. And there's no way that you can make that any better. There's no places you can go. There's no way that you can do anything. So you're pretty much stuck in a situation where you have the desire to have things. You have the effort, you're motivated, you're willing to work really hard to get that stuff. You have no way to get there. It's not like it's on the other side of a glass wall. You can look at it, but you can't touch it. You can see it, but you can't have it. And not surprisingly, when you tie this into this idea of sort of family level identity and all the rest of it, what you get is a large chunk of a whole part of a continent where the large part of the population is really, really frustrated because they see the rest of the world, at least as they see it, because they're looking at media, as having things that they're not allowed to participate in. And it's not because they're lazy. It's not because they won't work. It's just because they're in the wrong place and at the wrong time. And not surprisingly, they're really, really bitter about that. And so if you can't get the stuff from outside, what you do is you can predate on your neighbors inside and you can take it from them. To a certain extent, what you see, for example, in, say, online gaming, where you whack your competitors who are playing the same game, to a certain extent, that logic would probably seem like some more normal operating procedures in a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa, simply because the way that part of the world has been set up in the past, how that's morphed into the present, and it's left just a sort of a walking disaster for all intents and purposes. You've got a part of the world which cannot participate in the 21st century, but it's a rapidly growing part of the world. On one hand, large parts of it, especially in the South, are seriously sort of fundamentalist Christian. On the other hand, you have what, as far as we know, is the highest rates of HIV AIDS in the planet. Up to 60, 70% of the adult population in some of these areas, especially in the southern region, has HIV. So you've got a population which doesn't have access to resources, and doesn't have a economic future, but you also have these staggering population demographic disease problems, which of course compromise them even more. If you're a modern, production facility and you're moving from China to Vietnam and you're thinking, well, where's the next cheap place for labor? You might think of Africa. But the minute you see something like, 60, 70% of the population is demographically defined as having HIV, you're thinking, I'm not moving a factory there. So, they're just, I don't know, they're sort of out of the loop. And yet, because the population's increasing, and because there's such a large part of the available world's resources there, the time in the past where you could just sort of pretend they weren't around, say even in the 1960s, you just sort of pretend this area didn't count. In 2020, that's not possible. So figuring out how to make this region work for the people to live there is probably one of the major sort of social, demographic, morality issues in the 21st century. Because if that gets any worse, you've got all sorts of issues, from terrorism to genocide to all the list just goes on and on and on. And that always spills over into other areas. It just doesn't stay there. So, and then, if you go and look at that Wikipedia thing, which I've attached, the atrocities in the Congo, you saw the situation that the Belgian government, in fact, the king of Belgium still has a ruling family. They never apologized for the brutal way they treated the population of the Congo. And here it is in 2020, and they still don't think it's like, that happened in the past. It was really too bad. Probably shouldn't have done that. But hey, it's in the past. It's now 2020. Let's just let the past be the past. You can't have that mindset anywhere, because just like the rest of the world, folks in this part of the world in Africa, they too live in their history. And their history is that the outside world takes advantage of them, rips them off, exploits them every way possible, And then when they have any needs, the rest of the world just sort of, does the three monkeys and just ignores them. And with that, I hate to say it, but that's probably sort of a summary of this region. If I can find it, I'll be sending you a video on the relationship between Botswana and Zimbabwe. An old video, but very, very well done, and actually pretty accurate even right down till today. So even though it's old, situation hasn't really changed very much. So if I can find that, you'll be getting that as your next reaction. So with that, take care and have a good weekend.